All right. Well, a special good night to everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Globespan. Thanks to Nohar Singh and his team at Globespan for arranging this on a weekly basis. Every Monday and Wednesday, we are here to discuss critical issues that are affecting Guyana. Of course, these critical issues seems to be in a circle. They never leave the circle. So we're here to talk about those things and how we can provide you with the perspective and information to guide your engagement interaction with Guyana's politics and economics. Today, but before that, I just want to say there was a slight hurricane in Guyana, I believe, and I know it hit quite hard in certain parts of Guyana. Some of my own friends and families were affected, and we wish that everyone who were in the path that they were safe and they get better, and whatever they might have lost, they can recuperate as quick as possible. I know that also in Guyana, we want to send condolence to the person who died from that collapse of a building that was being dismantled in Georgetown, owned by Banks DIH. We want to send special condolence to that family and to those who were injured, speedy recovery. Today, our guests are no stranger to our audience. Timothy Jonas, an attorney. He participated in the presentation last week at the CCJ. And of course, he is an executive of a new and united Guyana. Welcome, Timothy, to this Wednesday show. And our other guest is Mr. Ramharack, Dr. Ramharack, an author, lecturer, an educator. He wrote two very in-depth biographies of Balram Singh Rai and, of course, Jang Bahadur Singh. Those books are available, I believe, on Amazon, and they're available in Guyana. Wherever you are, you can get access to these books. I was privileged to be part of one of them in depth, and the other one to some extent in helping to build an image for them. Today, of course, we were supposed to have our good friend James McAllister. Unfortunately, for reason unknown to us, he could not make it to the show. And I just want to say that every week we make special attempt to get voices and perspective from APNU, AFC side of the discussion. And to a large extent, this doesn't get passed, and somehow they're unable to be online. In fact, we make extra special effort to have their voices and to have their perspective on these shows. However, we can't control whether they come on the show or not. With that, I just wanted to welcome everyone again. And tonight we'll be talking about making sense of the political conflict. Our political conflict wasn't born on December 18, or it wasn't given birth on March 2nd, or it didn't start last week with the CCJ. It continues for a very, very long time since independence and even pre-independence. With the introduction of slavery into Guyana, and then indentureship, and then you had colonial presence that established, a society that saw people as different and treated them differently. But before we get into the meat of the matter today, as we look at the causes and some of the way out of the current conflict, we should talk about the CCJ ruling today. Of course, Timothy Jonas was deeply involved in the case. I think he presented for Anug and a few others. So, Timothy, why don't you give us an analysis of or maybe what transpired today, what came out of it, and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Salim. Thanks for having me. Doc, good to see you. I haven't seen you in a little while. Yeah. I hope you're well.
I am, thank you.
Well, it's another episode in the saga. Maybe it's the final episode, I don't know. One of the issues that I have been bemoaning is that although everyone except APNU itself recognizes that there was electoral fraud and has been unanimous in condemning it and in the steps moving forward and the legal requirements for moving forward, there has been stubborn resistance. But the large tragedy is that the further we go along this road, the smaller the opportunity for a graceful exit by Mr. Granger in a way that will leave him some dignity and leave his supporters with hope for another election cycle 5 years from now. There needs to be something left at the end of this, and I think that they are really closing off all plausible avenues, and that really worries me, that concerns me. The latest episode, of course, involved Eslyn David's application to the Court of Appeal. Now, the background of that we're familiar with, but I think we need to go over it to give it context. There was a recount. I'm sorry, this is the time I've been knocked off. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I think we were all knocked off.
Yeah, we're all
okay, great. I'm glad it's not my fault.
It's that hurricane that Salim was talking about.
Oh, maybe, possibly. So the recount was done. The figures of the recount were clear. It gave PPP an advantage of 15,000 votes over APNU. And during the course of the recount, a number of objections had been raised by APNU agents by correspondence to GCOM, alleging dead voters, overseas voters, all the refrain that we're so accustomed to now, documents missing. Despite that, the CARICOM observers were clear, and I believe that GCOM also came to the conclusion that the recount was credible, that the result of the recount should be relied on, and therefore on the 14th of June, Justice Claudette Singh, the chairman, instructed Lowenfield to prepare his report under Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act for the allocation of seats in Parliament, specifically telling him to use the results of the recount. Now, this prompted the novel application by Ms. David, of course prompted by APNU once again. She went directly to the Court of Appeal under Article 177 of the Constitution, which allows an application to be made directly to the Court of Appeal where a question arises as to the validity of the election of a president insofar as his qualifications to be president are concerned or an interpretation of the Constitution is required. Now, that's very narrow. It has to do with questions concerning a president. The objection was taken in the Court of Appeal that Ms. David's application had nothing to do with a question of the election of a president. No president was in fact named in the application, and no interpretation of the Constitution was required, and therefore Article 177 did not apply. There's an old case application by UC Guyana from 1980, which is specifically on point, that was referred to. And as all of Guyana knows, the Court of Appeal blithely ignored UC Guyana, sought to distinguish it, sought to take jurisdiction, and made a pronouncement on the interpretation of Article 177.2 that votes means valid votes. Now, there was a sense of satisfaction in half of the country, and in fact, advice was given to the executive by the Attorney General that this suspect order of the Court of Appeal could not be appealed because Article 177.4 provides that orders of the Court of Appeal under that article are final, meaning no appeal is permissible. Of course, there's a big hole in that very absolute argument, which is that if the order of the Court of Appeal is not an order under Article 177, so if it is an order made without jurisdiction, so it is not an Article 177 order, then it doesn't enjoy the protection of that finality clause. So when we received the decision of the majority of the Court of Appeal, an appeal was lodged to the CCJ. And what is interesting and also sad is that in the mayhem which ensued on social media, on the state-owned news agencies, very few people tried to defend the decision of the Court of Appeal. Very few people tried to say that this decision is right and to articulate how it is that the Court of Appeal is justified in the decision it reached. What everybody did was to jump on this finality clause and say that this thing can't be appealed, the CCJ can't hear it. And that saddens me because it shows a dearth of integrity, an absence of morality. It shows that there was absolutely no concern in the rightness or wrongness in what the Court of Appeal did. What there was a triumphant arrangement by the institution, and upon the successful determination by the Court of Appeal, there was an absolute determination that this thing mustn't be looked at by anybody else. And I think that that reflects a subconscious knowledge that will never be expressed that something was wrong with the decision. And in fact, the CCJ gave a unanimous decision today. And in that unanimous decision, the CCJ said exactly that because the Court of Appeal acted without jurisdiction in respect of a matter which was not properly brought under Article 177, the finality clause, the no appeal clause, which only applies to Article 177 orders, did not apply, and therefore an appeal lay to the CCJ, and they promptly set aside the decision of the Court of Appeal. And they made two further findings in their decision and their judgment, which I have just been reading. The first was to agree with Justice Claudette Singh. She said, when she instructed Lowenfield to prepare the Section 96 recount, the Section 96 report based on the recount, she said that GCOM does not have the equipment. It is not a court. It can't conduct a hearing and take evidence, and GCOM cannot investigate the allegations made by APNU as to dead and overseas voters. It has to use its record. The CCJ said she was absolutely right in that regard, that any questions raised by APNU as to dead overseas voters, documents missing, are entirely for an elections petition to be filed after the elections are concluded. That was important. The second important aspect of the CCJ's decision, in addition to it setting aside what the Court of Appeal did, was to point out that when Lowenfield jumped on the Court of Appeal decision and promptly submitted a report where he made 100,000 votes disappear all by himself without explanation, GCOM said that that was unlawful. It was enabled by the erroneous decision of the Court of Appeal, but that in any event, this was not for Lowenfield to do. And that Lowenfield's role is to follow the instructions of GCOM and to prepare his report based on the recount as directed. So in any event, they said he could not do what he pretended to do. And they made a specific order setting aside as void and unlawful the report which he did file. Those were the two important elements, I believe, in addition to the overarching finding that the Court of Appeal had no jurisdiction and setting aside the order it made, saying that votes in Article 177(2) means valid votes.
Correct. Right. So, and based on those rulings, the one on the Court of Appeal had no jurisdiction initially, and the GCOM does not have the investigative authority on these claims, and the report that Lowenfield provided after the Court of Appeal that needs to be pulled back. Is the APNU is saying, and I've been listening to their shows and to their perspectives, that this is not a big deal. This is just part of the political wrangling here and there. It's of no consequence. I think that's the word they use. It's of no consequence and very little impact on the way forward and their victory. And of course, the PPP, on the other hand, is claiming that this is a clear case of moving forward with the known result of them winning by 15,000 plus votes, and for GCOM to now move to the next stage of a declaration and swear them in. Why would two such parties with so much at stake make such divergent comments about what happened today?
Spin. You see, the obvious answer to APNU when they say, oh, this wasn't important, is to say, well, then why did you file the application in the Court of Appeal in the first place? You filed an application with a specific intention. That intention was achieved in the Court of Appeal, and you ran happily, shouting through the corridors, saying, now we can get rid of votes. Lowenfield promptly did your bidding and made 100,000 votes disappear and reversed the result of the recount. And now that the CCJ has set all of that aside, you say it's not important. I find that incredible. I also wonder, because I also have been listening to the various spin doctors on the state media and the propaganda that's been put out. And I also wonder if it's not important that Lowenfield's report has been specifically set aside and declared unlawful, and that the CCJ has specifically said that it is not his role to take to himself the question of whether votes are valid or not, but that is for an election petition. So if that's not important, I heard Mr. Granger say today that it's still for GCOM to make a declaration based on valid votes. GCOM have already decided what votes are valid. They did so in their letter to Lowenfield on the 14th of June. And the CCJ has said that the chairman was quite right when she said GCOM could not pretend to be a court and investigate the allegations of anomalies by APNU. So when some spin is attempted that GCOM, this isn't important and GCOM still got to look at valid votes, nonsense. GCOM has already decided to use the recount. And if anybody wants to rely on anomalies, the forum to do that under Article 163 of the Constitution is by way of election petition.
Absolutely. And Dr. Ramharack, I want to bring you here. I'm quite sure you spent part of your day listening to the ruling by the CCJ, as well as some commentators around the issue. What is your thoughts and feedback on what you heard and what transpired today?
Well, let me just say, Tim, I think Tim is one of the most brilliant lawyers in Guyana today.
Not so, but thank you.
And if anybody should be wearing silk, it's probably him and Anil. So let me just say, and I'm going to look at this from a political perspective, but my first statement to your question is, and again, I'm looking at this from a political perspective. This to me is a political circus we're seeing, and this circus began when Mingo made his first declaration, right? It is clear to me Obviously, that the recount is transparent, and based on what the CCJ is saying, that this thing is now going to go back to GCOM, right? And I think pretty much everybody would agree with that. And if the coalition wants to challenge the results, they can go, or if they believe that there are so many irregularities, then they can file an election petition. And I think this information is there, and I think any legal, mind would tell you that this would probably most likely be the way that the CCJ, would decide on the case, right? But here's the thing. Regardless of what the CCJ decides, we know GCOM still has that role to play. So it now comes back to what GCOM is going to do, and what the GCOM chairperson is, how is she going to deal with this? I believe that the chairperson has some kind of leeway right now. If she's going to use those recount numbers, she has a leeway to say, hey, we can go and look at those numbers. But the question is, how do you get Low and Feel to submit an accurate list that reflects the recount? We've got a situation where he's taking out 15,000 votes. Well, you're saying that because of these irregularities, all of which has been proven unfounded, because you've got the war looking at the results of the election, you've got the recount. So we're now back to square one. So I started by saying that this is a circus. So the question for me is a broader question here, because this situation in Guyana has been handled, and rightfully so, by the legal minds, right? It's been one challenge after the next, and you've got all of these legal challenges taking place. At a certain point in this game, we have to consider the political aspect of this. How are we going to deal with this from a political perspective? So what I'm saying is, question is, where do we go from here? Are we now going to wait until GCOM make a declaration, which we don't know how that's going to, what shape or form that's going to take? Is Low and Feel, given what we know and what we've seen, and I'm trying to be realistic here, is Low and Feel going to fall sick? Is he going to disappear? Is he going to submit the same report, or maybe a different kind of report? So the question is, what next? And I think this is where the Guyanese people are looking at this, and I think everybody here, including the three of us on this panel, are throwing our hands in the air and say, hey, this nonsense, as Quina once says, this confounded nonsense must come to an end. So the question is, where do we draw the line? And so what I'm trying to say here is that we have to find other ways. This struggle has to take on some new dimensions. And I'm not ruling out the political challenges and all the nonsense that we are going to see. And to be honest, I've been on record before this election, after the election, and I have said very clearly that this government is not going to hand over power. They have made it very, very clear. And if you watch that video clip today, with the de facto President Granger, he's made it very clear that there have been many irregularities, and there seems to be a sense of confidence. And maybe the coalition or the PNC knows something that we don't know. They seem very confident that GCOM is going to do their bidding, and we're going to be back in a situation where this thing is continuously going to be dragged out. And I don't see an end from where I'm sitting, and given all the things that have happened so far, I don't see this coming to an end anytime soon. And
I want to ask you the same question I asked Timothy about the divergent views of APNU and PPP as it relates to the ruling this afternoon by the CCJ. Politically, what danger can we experience from such hard position on something that is clearly, and even the judges, the president of CCJ said that constitutions are clear, and the rulings today were very, very clear. But you get divergent views by APNU and PPP. What danger does it have as it relates to the reality on the ground today?
Yeah, and as Tim said earlier, this situation, has further divided people, right? We're coming to a tunnel that seems to be very constricted, and there's no way we can kind of see the light out of this tunnel. So my point is, it is a divided situation. You've got one side that are telling you in many different languages and in very clear terms that we are not going to budge. We don't care what the results show. We don't care, about a lot of things. The point is, this government is not showing any indication that it is willing to acquiesce or it is willing to recognize the valid votes that were casted. So you do have that divided situation, right? And of course, this election has further driven people apart. I mean, we can have a discussion about, where we can go from there. Yeah. But I think the critical point right now, given the division we have, and I'll be very blunt, but I'll be very careful with my words. What I'm seeing here and what I'm going to say is that, as I said before, this struggle has to take on some new dimensions. I believe you have kind of run the ground in terms of what are some of the legal things you can do. I think the pressure has to be upped on this government. I think there should be protests, and I've used these words carefully. I've said that there ought to be safe, controlled, peaceful protests in Guyana, because you can't have the international community and everybody looking at Guyana and backing you. This is the best opportunity you've got to show the world that here, you're going to support us, but also we have to show that we're concerned about the plight that we're in. I understand there are situations, and of course, I'm living in the safety and comfort of my home, and I'm saying that. But I think that's the reality of what we're dealing with. I think sanctions has to be more forcefully called on, especially at this time, and especially personal and political sanctions. Those things ought to be emphasized. And I'll close with this, and I think this struggle has to take on some new dimensions.
Mm-hmm. And Timothy, today in the president of the CCJ comments, he referred to Guyana not having a government for more than a year. And we saw the shenanigans of GCOM. We've seen Mingo activities. We've seen low and field reports, and we don't have a government. We don't have. We've had an election. We've spent something 8 billion plus on an election. We have no result. Are we? How deep are we in an unconstitutional state?
I think the president said we haven't had a parliament for more than a year. But I'm not going to split a hair about that. We have been in an untenable situation for far too long. The amount of money we spent on the elections, I don't think registers one or another. I don't think that's very important. What's important is that we should have had a result declared less than 15 days after the election, and we did not. We are now 4 months down the road, and I hear the talk about protests. I'm afraid I do not see that the PPP has any traction protesting, putting feet on the street. I think that the only response that would get would be mild laughter. The PPP has never been able to win the roads, has never been able to do it, and Chedi himself has not been able to get PPP supporters onto the road in any situation of contention, face off with APNU, with the PNC and no APNU. I don't think that's the solution. From the outset, I have expressed the view that our only hope lies with the foreigners. I was very relieved that Mingo's fraud was done in front of the American ambassador, the Canadian High Commissioner, the English High Commissioner, and all the observers, European Union and OAS and Commonwealth and all of that. So they were able to cry out with a single voice. The opposition parties also were there and saw that fraud and also cried out with the same voice. They would have had far less traction if the international folk had not been there. I believe the international folk have been putting serious pressure on the individuals who are in government. I don't think those individuals want to be exposed to sanctions. Our links with the US are too close. We travel to the US. They like to travel to the US. The president isn't a young man. He's got a family. I don't think he wants a situation where his children, his wife, can't travel to the US, where they're blocked off from that kind of thing. And the same applies for so many of the others who are now pretending to be ministers in government. I think that is where it lies. I was heartened by the comments by the US Secretary of State and by their department that has management over the Americas, that took a very strong line by their response, that they haven't been listening to anecdotal evidence, that they got the truth straight from the mouth of their ambassador who saw it happen. So the international pressure is where I think the traction will take place. And what happened today in the CCJ for me was the last legal resort that the incumbent was clinging to that has collapsed. Mm-hmm. With the CCJ's very clear ruling, there is no legal avenue left by which the incumbent can justify staying in office. And there is nothing by which the incumbent can justify trying to dilute the threat of isolation from CARICOM, from OAS, from the Commonwealth, the threat of sanctions from the international community. They may go to the extreme and stay in illegally, but I don't think that they can do that for any length of time. Guyana doesn't have the financial fat to withstand real sanctions and real isolation. And by doing so, I think they recognize they will destroy our economy. They will make us a pariah, but that they will lose the support of their own loyalists. Even though shrinking numbers of people who are still willing to come and support them, they will lose that very support, and they will self-destruct if they try to do that. So I believe that the help of the international community is more important than anything that the locals can put on the ground. And I am very, very heartened that they are there and willing to ensure that democracy obtains in Guyana.
And a question for both of you. You mentioned that that APNU have no legal alternative. This might have been the last legal option that they've exhausted. And they've also been talking tough about not leaving, and that they cannot concede to an election that was fraudulent, etc. In the face of global pressure, regional pressure, and even local pressure, by the bar associations and so on, and so many others. What do you believe APNU would be doing over the next week or months to remain in power if they're not going to concede, or whatever GCA might have come up with, they might not agree with? So what are they going to do to stay in power?
Well, let me just say before I answer that, Salim, and I want to go back to what I said before. When you look at societies and you see situations where things have kind of deteriorated to this extent, one of the things we have to say about Guyana right now is that we do, as Tim says, we do have the focus of the world. Right, you've got the regional states, you've got and organizations and so on, and I think we in Guyana have never, in all the 28 years of struggle that people have been engaged in against the PNC, we've never been this kind of fortunate to have that kind of focus on Guyana. And I want to say this to Tim, and I think others who feel, obviously the international community is going to be supportive. We know that. But when you look at societies that have kind of disintegrated to this kind of level, and you are now going all out, and I'm not saying, we shouldn't be doing this. You're challenging the system legally. But I think the international community also would like to see what people are doing in the country itself if they're going to support you. And when we talk about, protests, and I want to explain this, protest doesn't have to be done in a way that put the lives of people in danger. Chedi Jagan, we talk about him all the time. He was in and out of jail. He was always engaged, and he was leading protest struggle in Guyana. he was also doing it outside of Guyana. And I think the international community, the diaspora, the so-called diaspora, has a role to play here. The opposition has elements, people outside of Guyana that can lead those struggles. And I think protests can also take many different forms in a country. You look at what people are doing in places like, Hong Kong and other places. There are people who are driving their car. They have an hour where they have signs on the car and they're blowing their horn, right? They're doing different things. So protests can come in different form. And I think when you try to rule that out, you're in a sense not keeping that continuous focus. And I think organizations and countries can also point to the fact that here there's disenchantment, there's protests, there are things that are happening. And I do want to put political leaders on the spot by saying this. And again, I'm prefacing this by saying, yes, I'm saying this from the comfort of my home, but I've also been in Guyana struggling for 28 years. And I know there are many ways you can protest. And I know this seems like a repetition, but there are things that has to be done, right? And I think the leadership has to show that they are concerned and they're willing to take some chances to keep the focus and the spotlight in Guyana. Because if you keep saying, well, the international community is on our side, and on the other hand, we're saying, well, we're coming to the end of the rope here where the legal challenges are coming to an end. My question is, what do we as a people in Guyana, given all the restrictions and the constraints we are facing with, what do we do and how do we show the international community that, hey, we are part of this struggle and we are willing to take some chances to be out? And I keep emphasizing safe, controlled, peaceful demonstrations. It doesn't have to be in an area where there's danger, and it can come in many different forms. And I don't see that political aspect of the struggle taking place as yet, given what we know so far. And again, it comes back to the fact that this government does not seem to be any concern. They do not care about what anyone says. They are making it clear. You listen to Mr. Granger's statement today. They are not going anywhere. And it seems that, as Taron Kamraj just stated in another show, that they do have some kind of backing. Maybe it's from the Chinese or maybe it's from Venezuela. But the point is, they are making this known in many different ways. And I know there's always a hope that we keep doing, going the legal route. And again, I want to be clear what I'm saying. Protests can take many different forms, and it can be done. And I am putting this onus on the leadership in Guyana. And I'm saying there are also people outside of Guyana who can up the ante, and they can also be engaged in actions as they have been doing, like writing to congressmen and so on, especially at this crucial time in Guyana.
So, Timothy, you're on the ground in Guyana. Of course, you live and work and operate and engage in the politics and everything else that's Guyana. Do you share Dr. Veteran's perspective on the winning side, being a little more vocal, being more active to show the world that, hey, we really want this victory. We don't want you to give it, but we want to take ownership of this victory. Do you share that? And if you don't, what are some of the options for the PPP right now to sort of assert themselves, given that they do have the backing of the local, regional, and international communities?
Well, Sam, I think there's more a question for the PPP. As you know, I am not a supporter of the PPP.
But Tim, your party want to see it.
And we're very happy for it. But that just gives us one seat in the opposition. And you will note that will be a seat in the opposition along with APNU. But I get the impression that every effort, as has been pointed out, is already being made in terms of lobbying overseas. Now, anyone who deals with conflict resolution and protests and political issues like that will tell you that you can't control a fire. When a fire starts, it has to burn its way out. And therefore, there's no such thing as a decision to have a peaceful protest or a small protest or a polite protest where everybody goes home for dinner afterwards. If you're going out to protest, you don't know what's going to happen, and how the chips fall. And I've heard Doc talking about 28 years, but every 5 years in those 28 years, there was a rigged election, and the rig was successful, and any protests that took place were laughed at and had no effect whatsoever. So when you look at that, I don't think anything has changed today. The leverage that is there today is the focus by the international community and the importance of what we are doing, because it's not that we're wringing our hands in despair and doing nothing. We have been carrying this fight loudly on every platform that we can carry it, including this platform here tonight. We have to keep pushing that, and we have to show that every single legal avenue that has been pursued by APNU, whether honestly or dishonestly, has been closed, so that they have no plausible excuse anymore. Any step they take now is an illegal step. And I think that is important to demonstrate, and we have gotten there. We have gotten to that milestone where we can now demonstrate it. Anything they do now, other than simply stepping out of office, will be obviously illegal. And I think that is what needs to be demonstrated, and we are demonstrating it.
Can I just ask a question, though, Salim?
Absolutely.
But I mean, everything they have done, not now, but since March 2nd, has been illegal, right? I mean, I think everybody in Guyana is very frustrated with what they're seeing, and everybody outside of Guyana. But the point is, if we're, and again, I'm asking this question, if we are at a point right now where we're seeing that this government is not going anywhere, and they've made it clear in many different ways, it seems to me that they're willing to invite sanctions, right? But they're not willing to budge. And we've come to that point. My question is, what do we do from here? What form does this struggle continue to take? Are we going to say, well, let's leave it up to the international community who will, force this government out of order? That's not going to happen. I don't see that happening. So the question is, what are we doing in Guyana as leaders, and how are we going to take this thing to the next level if all avenues are closed? And I think it's a misnomer to say that Chedi was, did not. I mean, Chedi was involved in a lot of different things, and a lot of he was always in and out of prison, to put it mildly. But there were other people outside also in Guyana who struggled and who kept the pressure on. But this government is not willing to leave office. They're not willing to allow Irfan Ali to become president of Guyana, the rightful winner, and they are willing to invite sanctions. It seems to me, and I think anybody who's blind will tell you that they don't give a damn. They don't care. And everybody, you look at social media today, everybody is asking, well, what next? And it seems like we're just begging and hoping and praying that this government will come to its sense. Politics is not like that. And I can't think of a country where we have 196 countries in the world. I cannot think of a country where we have a situation like what we have in Guyana, where people are saying, look, we're going to leave it up to those people outside. Things don't happen like that. Something has to click. Salim talked about a hurricane. That hurricane has to come from someplace. And I think at some point, leaders in Guyana have to throw their hands up in the air and say, we have had enough. Guyana has a long history of struggle. The question is, what do we do next? Are we going to wait until the GCOM make its next move and wait until the coalition make its next move? Or that's my, and I'm expressing my frustration here.
If I can ask you a question in response to your question, is a conflict. Because we're talking about making sense of the current conflict, which is a continuation of a conflict that has been around for hundreds of years in Guyana. Is going to the street and protesting and creating more conflict? Does that help the winner, or does that help the incumbent? I believe, and I would think that times have changed also, where protest doesn't have to be, being locked up and having your guys on the streets every day and holding placards. We see that revolutions are online these days, and protests are happening everywhere. So my question is, do we want to inflame? And as Timothy said, if a fire is started, we just have to leave it to burn to the end. Is that helpful to the current conflict that we have if we start another conflict on the street?
Is that for me, Salim?
Well, for both of you.
Well, for me, you see, Salim, I don't agree with Bertram at all on this, because he talks about Chetty in and out of prison. Okay, the gentleman spent some time going in, spent some time going out. But at the end of the day, none of it worked, and he was out of power for 28 years. And the only time he got into power is as a result of threats by Carter through the then president. So again, the only time he got into power was because of foreign influence.
Mm-hmm.
All of his so-called protests were jeered at, were laughed at. Nothing, they were not taken seriously. And none of it worked until a foreigner came along and said, you're out of the IMF, you're not getting any more foreign aid, you will be bankrupt if you continue to rig the election. And that is what changed it in 1992. So I agree. You're right. On social media, on these platforms, we protest. But there will be no traction on the street. Look, in this same escapade.
But come back to what we have prefaced all these questions with. In 1992, that reference you were making when the international community came to Guyana, and we saw a change, and Chetty won the election, a free and fair election. You have an incumbent right now that's saying no to international pressure, that's saying no to regional pressure. How do you rationalize that? How can the international community work if Hoyt did not allow? Go ahead.
Sorry. In 1992, GCOM was in Rob Street, and when it began to be apparent that there would be a PPP victory, large crowds gathered in Rob Street. Cars were broken, windows and buildings were broken. Large crowd.
Mm-hmm.
Not a PPP person present. Large crowds. At what point are you going to pretend that the PPP can put more people on the road, even to make a plausible demonstration? PPP do not control the road. They don't. And for you to suggest, for anybody to suggest, that PPP should go on the road is to escalate things rather than to help things.
Mm-hmm.
And even if, this is my view, even if an attempt was made to put supporters in Georgetown, nothing would come of it. It would not work. You would have what you've always had, which is in some obscure rural areas. And I don't say that disparagingly. The fact is, our economic center is town, is Georgetown. So if somebody, as they used to go in Bornacay and Field in Blairmont, that doesn't really affect Georgetown. If you got a little fighting up and conflict with police in Unity, that doesn't affect Georgetown. But that is all that PPP has ever been able to muster. So you want to send Uriah to the forefront of the battle, but I don't see an end result in that, and I don't recommend it.
Well, okay, so I'm saying there's a comprehensive plan to this, right? And people don't have to be in the middle of George Strong. I mean, we've seen what happened in 1998 and so on after the election. But I'm saying there are other things that has to be done. For instance, we talk about the sanctions, a more aggressive call for sanctions, right? So that's something that can be done. And if the protests can be done in Guyana, they certainly can be done in places outside of Guyana. And I think that's something that political leaders in Guyana can reach out to people to do, because you do want to keep the focus on Guyana, and especially at this crucial and critical time. But I do feel uncomfortable, when we say there's nothing that can be done and we're going to leave it up to the international community, because at a certain point, the international community has to know that there are people in Guyana who are hungry, to promote democracy and to keep this whole democratic system going before this, this impasse that we're in. And so that's my opinion on that. But
of course, the international community took 28 years also, right? To reach us in 1992 and say, hey,
then maybe, Tim, what Guyana needs is a Walter Rodney, who can be out there and mobilize people. So it doesn't have to be from the PPP. It can be Timothy Jonas. It can be Ralph Ramkaran. It can be Mr. Schumann. And I think this is where the mettle of leadership. And again, I know I'm speaking from the safety of my home, and I think these are things that also make leadership, and it shows you where people stand. And I think we're now getting close to that breaking point. And again, I'm not saying people should go and risk their life. And I use the phrase safe, controlled, peaceful protest, which can be done in many different ways. But we can leave that as it is.
Yeah, and coming back to the larger question of conflict in Guyana, and this is where I want to take the conversation. And of course, this current political impasse has highlighted the fracture that we've had in Guyana for so many decades, and we try to plaster it with constitutional reform, with shared governance. We've rigged election and so on. I know, Betaram, you've been involved with free and fair elections. Even in fact, the Carter Center coming to Guyana in 1992, you and many others in New York were integral in that. You in letter writing, postcard writing. I remember as a kid, I used to help you do those things. A lot of protests, a lot of organization on the ground, a lot of fundraising were done, and so on, to highlight to the world that there isn't a free and fair election, and there's need for a free and fair election. How much of that, the sentiments at that time, are you seeing reflected in what's happening today?
Well, Salim, obviously things have changed, and the one obvious change has to do with the fact that, social media is very much engaging our attention, right? I mean, before we came on this program, we saw Mr. Granger make a statement about irregularities, and he made it clear that they're not going anywhere. This is going back to GCOM. And it seems like Mr. Granger knows something that GCOM is going to do that the rest of us don't know. So obviously, with the explosion of social media, we have more of a focus on seeing and having that instant information. But at the same time, social media has also created, that division, and you have people posting things that are much more visceral, which you can see. So those things are obviously very different. The other thing that's also very different in Guyana is the fact, and we can allocate blame to the PPP and the PNC for this, is the fact that, and I know Tim keep cautioning us about protests and what's going to happen, but the fact of the situation is we have a situation in Guyana where we can strongly argue that this government has planted its feet down and is not willing to move, because they also know fully well that the PPP and the opposition is playing within the rules of the game that's established, right? Barnum, in a sense, you have to deal with the opposition. But the fact remains that this government knows that the coercive arms of the state, meaning the army, police, the people's militia, and of course the bureaucracy in Georgetown, are, if you want to use the word kith and kin, but those things are under their influence. So those things are very different today in a sense that Mr. Granger, I believe, with all the appointments he has made and the fact that he has a close relationship with those coercive forces, makes it much more difficult today for the opposition to be able to make a strong claim and say, hey, we won the election, we expect you to remove yourself from office and allow us swearing in. And this is the reason also, and people don't talk about this much, but that's also a contributing factor for the coalition, to say, hey, we're not going anywhere, we won this election, and there's nothing you, the regional states, or the international community can do to remove us from office. So they have no respect for the opposition. They know the opposition is weak. And this is why they keep saying, well, we don't care about the CCG ruling. That's their thing. We have a constitution, and we're going to decide this thing at home. So the forces, right, the coercive forces, as I've said, are firmly in the hands of the PNC / the coalition. And they understand that. They know that's also one of their strongest, reasons for holding on to power. And I think, and again, like I said, you can argue that the PPP did not attempt to balance these forces or to change these institutions. but that is an overriding force that has to be reckoned with. And I think this is why people are now looking at the international community to put some kind of pressure on this regime. And hopefully that pressure will come with more of a fuller force. And I think it will come, with personal and political sanctions. I believe the U.S. Will not, move towards economic sanction given the condition, we're dealing with COVID and the economic ramifications of those things. But they will do as they've done to, folks like in Iran or Venezuela. They will move to impose personal and political sanctions. And I think that's where this is heading at this point.
Timothy, are you seeing a resurgence of the old PNC sort of tactic of pre-1992, resorting to other ways of keeping power rather than a free and fair election?
Well, I wouldn't like to do a comparison with pre-92. I do agree that the institutions are skewed. We saw it with the GCOM Secretariat, personnel appointed by, Patterson and Lowenfield that did their best to obstruct. There were some professionals there, but by and large, we know that the top tier of the GCOM Secretariat went rogue and are still going rogue. Mm-hmm. If you want to draw a comparison, PPP representatives staged a strike outside Ministry of Foreign Affairs a few days ago, and you will remember some were arrested and had to go to court. We've been seeing protests by APNU people equally, but nobody has been arrested there. So it is one-sided, it's not even-handed. And we have to acknowledge the police have done the best that they can in a hard situation. The top tier of the police have so far been professional. Their operations and their activity, for example, at the conference center, were highly professional. But we cannot pretend that there is total impartiality there. And it's a small step. You see, dictatorship comes incrementally, and we are seeing it. We are seeing it in small creeping steps, and it needs to stop now, which is why this is the time to make the noise and why we've been making the noise now. Because if what's being attempted succeeds now, in 5 years, we will be beyond redemption, and they will be stuck.
Yeah. And here's a question for both of you. Why has the PNC, APNU in its current incarnation, over its history, and of course, we all know fully well that the APNU and PNC is primarily a party with an African base. Why has it resorted to rigged election? I'm not saying that the PPP is a very diverse party either. I'm saying they do have a strong ethnic
both sides historically.
Why is rigged election a go-to tool for the APNU?
Both sides historically have been guilty of electoral fraud. I will remind you about Gokul back in 2011, who tried to steal a seat for the PPP to give them the majority in parliament. So neither of them is pure as the driven snow. But the easy answer to your question is that, as you say, APNU is their ethnic base is Afro-Guyanese, PPP's ethnic base is Indo-Guyanese, and the Indo-Guyanese demographically outnumber the Afro-Guyanese, so that they have a head start at every elections, and therefore the system that we have now is unfair because it gives a head start at every election to the PPP. APNU have to do an incredible job to get that swing vote to stay in power, whereas the PPP can pretend they're a monarchy just by being mediocre because they already have the numbers from their base, from their demographic base, to give them the win. If the system is inherently unfair, the system needs to be fixed. And if we ignore that and pretend that we have a democracy, where of the two large parties, one has a 20% advantage before you even get to the poll, then we're fooling ourselves and we're in for another rocky road in 5 years. It is aggravated by the winner-take-all system, so that one side with their unfair numerical demographic advantage take all, even though they only get 51% of the votes.
Mm-hmm. And Beturam, why is rigged election a first go-to tool for an Afro-ethnic party like PNC?
Well, I mean, we've written about this, and whatever we've said, it's in public record. But obviously, when the PP had a majority, it was difficult for the PNC to win an election. So historically, for that 28 years, up to the point with Hoyt in 1992, you have a situation where the PNC felt that this was the only way they could actually win an election. But I want to go back to something that Tim said. In 2015, the population demographics has changed, right? In 2015, the PNC, did gain swing votes, coalition, right? Swing votes. If you can remember, Moses, 11% with the AFC, they were able to win that election. Now, we know that swing vote. Let's assume that it came in with the AFC. That swing vote was not put to good use because obviously the PNC has thrown the AFC under the bus. So that is why they were able to win that election in 2015. The PPP does not have a majority today. So in 2020, there was a study that was done by Rory Fraser, and he's written two letters in Starbuck News, and these were published recently. And basically, he argued that the PPP won in 2020 because of all the nonsense that took place from 2015 to 2020. The PPP won with swing votes. So it's not accurate to say that the PPP does have an advantage today. In the past, yes, and I think, Salim, that justified, the reason for the PNC to try to rig themselves and to stay in power. And obviously, Barnum and Hoyt were very good at doing that. But as it stands today, that swing vote is there. And what we have been arguing is that both the coalition and the PPP had a chance of winning the election. In 2015, the PPP lost. In 2020, that swing vote came back to them, and they won the election based on what we know about the recount. So no party has an advantage. Now, we can argue and talk about the fact that, okay, whoever wins, has tremendous, power at the presidential level and so on. And we can talk about the kind of system, that we can implement. There was a letter that was written recently by Gwen Eiffel and Arif Bolkan. One of the things that's suggested, as we have always been suggesting, is that we can have a situation where you can create conditions, and again, this doesn't have to do with constitutional change alone. You can create conditions where you address the perception of those people who feel that they're being deprived. We've talked about things like an ethnic impact statement that can address those issues of perception that one ethnic group is benefiting, from the largest of the state. We've talked about things like federalism. We've talked about balancing the force. So any discussion about how we can change this dynamics obviously has to do with constitutional change, but I think it's also very important when we talk about attitudinal change. How are we going to address that, and how are we going to change the institutions of power in Guyana?
Do you think one of the issue that's affecting exactly what you just said in terms of addressing some of the issues in Guyana is that the policymakers, the lawmakers themselves are not defining themselves correctly. In other words, we have an APNU government who feel they represent everyone, yet 50% said, hey, you don't represent me, I didn't vote for you, and you've thrown me under the bus. And today you've got like a PPP win, and then you have the other side saying, hey, I'm going to lose everything that I worked for, and the hopelessness steps in again. So is it time, maybe before we talk about federalism and shared governance and all that kind of stuff, that maybe Guyanese leaders need to start understanding the deeper issue of race and ethnicity, and how it impacts governance, and how it impacts resources, and how it impacts just about every aspect of life in Guyana.
You know,
Yeah,
Salim, I
I'm
I
sorry.
heard Bertram talk about the erosion of the demographic advantage, but then he discounted it altogether. And in doing so, I think he's fooling himself. After 23 years of PPP governance, of increasing corruption, of poor performance, of serious problems, of a petulant and disdainful government and flagrant corruption, the best that the combined opposition could do, all of them, in 2015 was to win by 4,500 votes. So at a hiatus, at the best they could do, at the height of their honeymoon period, when traditional PPP supporters were young enough that many of them only heard of the bad old days anecdotally, when those same young voters had risen above ethnic division, when those same young voters were willing to cross the barrier and reject the old stories from their parents, the best that the combined opposition could muster was 4,500 votes in advance. And 5 years later, although everybody still remembers the old corruption, 5 years later, because of a mediocre performance, the corruption was increasing under APNO, but it hadn't reached those pre-2015. You saw incompetence, yes, but you saw incompetence beforehand. In a flash, they lost by 15,000 votes and 10,000 going to small parties. Now, that is indicative of a continuing demographic advantage. You cannot get away from it. As long as there's that demographic advantage, where we have a two-party system, we have an unfair situation. And it is aggravated because it is ethnically based. So as you just said, there's the mutual distrust. That when your side wins, 50% feels that they're out on the road. And when the other side wins, 50% feels that they're out on the road. It's two sides of the same coin. It's pots and kettles looking at each other. And we need to recognize this. And
But
the
we are
solution is
recognizing
not
it.
to
You and I
say,
are recognizing it. Is it time for leaders to start recognizing it? That's my
but
point.
the leaders know it, and the leaders enjoy it, and the leaders benefit from it. That is why 2020 elections was a two-party race, because the ethnic tensions and the mutual accusations were ramped up. And the mutual suspicion was so high that each side was able to say to their party loyalists, you don't want those horrible people in there. So you heard stories about Danger Granger, about Bharat. You heard those kind of nonsensical cross accusations, and not a single party condescended to talk about economic policies, social policies. They didn't care, it didn't matter, because both sides benefit from ramping up that mutual ethnic suspicion. So when we talk about educating them, some of the most educated people in this society have demonstrated themselves to be the most unshakable, unmovable racists in this last escapade. So it's not about education. Some of the most humble people I've spoken to have demonstrated that they're open-minded and rise above it. It's not about education. But as long as we have this two-party system in Guyana, we will have this tension. And as long as the two-party system benefits in a winner-take-all state, you will have the mutual suspicion, the mutual distrust, and you will have a fight, a battle. And that's what we have, a battle. This is authored by both sides, orchestrated by both sides, and we're in the middle of a mess because of the battle of the pots and the kettles.
So Ramharack, the two parties have benefited over the last 60 years because of their ethnic base. And of course, Guyana has not benefited. Guyana has retrogressed economically and in so many other ways. You know, most of us have left Guyana to find greener pastures. The economy is tanking and is getting even worse. You know, education level and so our society, our institutions, and so on have all deteriorated because of the ethnic divide. Is it time? Is it time that these race-based parties figure out a better way to use their race support or ethnic support towards the benefit of Guyana?
Yeah, and this is where I agree with him. And that's obviously is the long-term goal, right? But we can talk about what is and what ought to be. So we want to get to that point where all of us can feel that we are part of this society. But we do have a history here. But at the same time, I mean, there's a lot of recommendation out there about how to share the corn, so to speak. But the issue here is my point is that we've had a swing in 2015. We have a swing in 2020. Maybe in 2025 you may have another swing if the PvP mess up. Then you may have a swing to the coalition, assuming the coalition remain what it is. But the point is, and you're absolutely correct, a lot of this has to do with the elites and the political leaders. Politicians have done a terrible job when it comes to resolving this ethnic problem, which we call the ethnic security dilemma in Guyana, right? So that issue is there. But what I'm also seeing is that the conditions have changed today, but politicians remain the same. They have not changed. And I think, as you said, the coalition believe that they represent a coalition of all Guyanese, and the PPP have their own view. They believe that they can govern Guyana because they will talk about inclusive government. That's not going to be enough. It's not enough what the coalition is doing. So we have this great divide. But the fact remains that we've had this swing. And at the same time, we had a set of rules by which both political parties played by. So we have people voted. And I think for us to get to that next stage, you have to have that transition because everybody played by the same rules of the game. We agreed to enter into the election knowing what the conditions were in Guyana. And we expected a certain outcome that one or two political parties will be able to form the government or whatever the case may be, right? So we had that situation here, but here we have an impasse because the loser decided, okay, we're not gonna, play fair. We're just gonna squash this thing in the middle, and then we're gonna move on. So that issue has to be settled, and I think any discussion about what kind of shared government or inclusive government or whatever you want to call it that we can talk about, that has to come after that swearing-in process. And it can be a situation where the current coalition says, well, okay, if you guys want to talk about shared government, let's talk about it. It can't happen like that. You have to get past this situation where we had an election and a winner has to be sworn in, and then you can sit down and talk about how we can address this problem. Because keep in mind also, people, when they voted for this system that they have, right? So that change has to emanate from the leadership. It has to emanate from the politicians, from the political leaders, and that has to go down to the rank and file, whether it's through a referendum or some other means by which you can change the system. But before we get to that point, I think all three of us can agree here that we do need some kind of system where all Guyanese can be part of it, whether it's whatever that concept of shared government is, or whether it's inclusive government. But you're absolutely correct. Both sides have a different perspective of what that kind of government look like, and I think that's also creates an impasse, and it creates another stumbling block. So how to address those issues and kind of move on to make every Guyanese feel that they are part of the system.
How much of APNU's reluctance to concede or inability to want to move forward in recognizing that they have lost the election has to do with the winner-take-all system? I mean, they do represent a significant population in Guyana that are already experiencing hopelessness, that are already talking about losing so much and not being able to be part of the decision-making process in the governance of Guyana and so on. Of course, Indians have the same fear in pre-1992, and of course even in 2015, that should APNU win, we're outside. So both sides are somewhat very reluctant to want to give up because they will be out. So is Granger's decision and Harmon's decision and the leadership of the APNU AFC is part of their decision not to concede closed in knowing that their grassroots support don't want them to leave.
Bertrand made some points there that made me smile. He he said, first of all, that before there's any talk about changing the system, the democratic process has to work, and we have to have a swearing in of a new president. Now, I absolutely agree that Rule 1, unshakable, unmovable, the single pillar that holds us all up, is that our votes must count. The democratic system must work. That is why I've been at the front in this fight, fighting for a party that I do not support, because there is absolutely no doubt that if a dictatorship is successful, your vote will never count again. So the democratic process has to work, and this election has to be done fairly, and the PPP candidate has to be sworn in. I agree. But then Bertram jumped to a conclusion that I don't know how we reached. He said we had a swing vote out in 2015. Now we have a swing vote out again. And who knows, in 2025, there may be a swing vote out again. So let me ask the question rhetorically. Is there anybody in this forum who genuinely believes that come hell or high water, overtopping of the seawall or lightning strikes or Jesus Christ himself coming, that APNU, if they come out of office now, is going to win an election in 2025 by whatever miracle? Does anybody in this forum believe that? And since we can all agree that that will never happen because of the experience we're having now and because of the demographic advantage that the PPP have, imagine we can say sitting here that APNU will not win another election in 2025. We know that. We cannot pretend that there's no demographic advantage. We can't pretend that. So then the next question is, given that we know this, that the PPP are virtually secure in office if they get in this time, what motivates the PPP to have an honest discussion with APNU or us or anybody else to talk about power sharing, since they know that they are guaranteed to be a monarchy? And this has been troubling me personally for months now, because as I see APNU squeezing itself into a corner, I see that their support base, who are entitled to a say in the decision-making process, who are entitled to share the corn, to be in government and have a say, I see them losing that hope, and knowing that they're losing that hope because their leaders have squandered the opportunity to have a realistic chance in 2025 by the nonsense they're doing now. So the APNU leadership is betraying their own support base and squeezing out any possibility that they will have a success and making it much more difficult without protests and violence to force PPP to come to a table to have a real discussion as to inclusive governance, power sharing, constitutional reform, anything. There is nothing now to motivate PPP to have a discussion about power sharing. The PPP own supporters say with those people never, not recognizing the racism in that statement in itself. So how do we move from there? That is the conundrum we are in now, and that is the serious problem we are in, because let me tell you, that 45%, they are entitled to a say in government. They are entitled to have their interests represented, and after 23 years of PPP, we know they were not represented.
Yeah. And knowing and coming back to what you were saying about the numbers game and the demographics game, what's the motivation for APNU to leave? You know, if they know numerically they can't get back in, so what's the motivation for them to play the game fairly?
That's the tragedy, yeah? They're going for broke now, because now it's all or nothing, and they're pretty close to nothing. But the tragedy is that if they had graciously demitted office, acknowledged defeat, and walked out on the 4th of March, they would have empowered the voter. The electorate, the man who puts his ballot in the ballot box, would have been able to say to himself and to the country and to the PPP and to APNU that I put APNU in 2015, I put PPP in 2020, and in 2025 I can put APNU back in. By empowering the voter that way, just by leaving quietly,
Absolutely.
they would have perpetuated what we are trying for here, which is a real swing vote. But that has now been destroyed. That
Ramharack,
is the tragedy.
Well, okay, so but I want to come back to the point earlier, right, that I made that the PPP does not have a inbuilt majority that will guarantee that they win a free and fair election, and I think we've seen that. In 2020, we've seen that to a certain extent in 2015. There was some swing vote. If you accept what Rory Fraser and his colleague are saying, because they've looked at the results, and like I said, they have written 2 letters in the Stabrook News. You can go back and check that. But here's the thing, though. Tim is arguing that if the PPP gets in, what is to stop them, from ruling and becoming a monarch? I think that's just totally ridiculous. And here's the reason why. If the PPP gets in and Irfan Ali is sworn in, the PPP does not have any control. And we have seen this time over and over again. The PPP does not have any control over the coercive arms of the state. We've seen the fact that the PPP will have to deal with a civil service that may be recalcitrant or may not be willing to, to follow through with policy implementation. We're seeing a situation where, and we notice that in Guyana, the PPP does not control a seat of government in Georgetown. So even if the PPP, and again, I hold no brief for the PPP, I'm just making the point that if the PPP gets to that position, which I know is going to be an uphill battle, because I'm looking at the Marara Waves now saying that the chief elections officer is unlikely to budge on results of the Caribbean Court ruling. So my point is this, and it's a simple point, is that the PPP will be in office. They could be governing, but they will not have substantial power. And the PNC, with their core support in Georgetown, can force that government to come to the negotiating table because they have the power to do so. Because you cannot change all of those institutions of power, and it's not going to happen. And therefore, the PPP has to recognize that those forces are going to be not necessarily on their side. And to me, that is a source that a leverage that the PNC has, where they can push for some kind of an inclusive government, and that's where that discussion. And here's the other thing about inclusive government and power sharing: those things don't necessarily happen. When you look at most countries in the world, it happens under two kinds of conditions. One is you have a civil war where people are divided, and if they can't come together, they split, like in South Sudan, right? And the other situation is where you have such a severe crisis that there is an outside force, like the US or some other force, that comes in and try to bring the parties to work together. So my point is, it's not accurate to say that if the PPP gets in, they're going to set up a monarch. Maybe they may be tempted to do that, right? But the point is, they have to reckon with the forces and the power that's going to put them in check. And I'm saying that at some point, once this swearing in is over, you have to come to that bargaining table to talk about that shape and form of that inclusive government.
Absolutely. And Betoram, is you mentioned that the PPP, even though they may win the election, may not have control or deep access to the coercive forces, the army, the police, the bureaucracy, and so on. And that of course is part of the destabilization and the disengagement of people and its livelihood in Guyana. So isn't that more of a reason why the PPP should take a more active posture, an active movement towards building a more inclusive governance system, rather than going back to the good old winner-take-all system?
Right, and that's my point. And I think those are the impetus that will force the PPP government to move in that direction, because I don't see a situation where, first to begin, I can't imagine where and when we will see a situation where the leader of the opposition will be sworn in. I'm not seeing that where I'm sitting, right? Maybe somebody can help me see that, but I'm not seeing that happening anytime soon. But the point that you're making, Salim, I do agree that those institutions have to be changed. And I think this is where the bargaining has to come in. We can talk about the constitutional changes and so on, obviously, which is necessary. We can talk about the constituency system. We can talk about how policy are going to be made. We can talk about having a caucus, maybe working, that represents a different ethnic group with the PPP, working with them. But those power centers, the point I'm trying to make is those power centers will prevent the PPP from moving in that direction, where if they believe that they're going to set up a system, as Jack Davis said, to rule for 40 years, that is never going to happen in Guyana. And I don't see the coalition supporters allowing that to happen in Guyana. And rightfully, all of us have to share in that corner, as I've said. And I think at that point, those kinds of discussion will have to take place, but it's pointless to talk about that situation or that discussion now, because you have a sort of an unequal balance, and we have an election issue that we have to deal with, and those things have to be resolved.
Absolutely. Well, we have a few more minutes until program time, so I want to bring Timothy in for his final statement. And for 50 years, Timothy, or more, probably 54 years, we've had a landscape where Afro-Guyanese have excused the excesses of their party that they vote for. So rigged election wasn't a big deal, not a big deal, of no consequence to the Afro-Guyanese, because it provided them the power and the resource that they need to survive. And the Indians, of course, for so many years, as you mentioned, have excused the excesses of the administration that they voted in, and for the same reason, it keeps the power, it keeps the resources, and it ensures that they control some of the levers of government and power. Why is it? Why have we been? Why is this so dangerous for Guyana, for us to be excusing our leaders for their excesses?
I think that's the center point of our problems. When I say that they're two sides of the same coin, I'll go further in your own example, which I like. You put rigging on PNC, but as I pointed out earlier, Gokul was quite happy to rig for the PPP. And ballot stuffing doesn't just happen in the Afro communities. It happens in the Indian strongholds as well. And on the flip side, you put the corruption on PPP, but we all know that those folk that like to quote from the Bible in government now have been increasing in corruption. They resemble each other, they reflect each other and mirror each other so accurately that it's startling. And it provides a lot of material for their loyalists to point fingers at the other side and talk about the ill doings of the other side without recognizing that their side is almost exactly the same, almost exactly identical. And the only thing that separates them is ethnicity. Now, we have to accept that and accommodate it. We're not going to change people's thinking. We're not going to educate anybody. We're not going to sing Kumbaya and hold hands and be one happy family. So we have to evolve a system that accommodates our reality of these two large groups. And the constitutional reform that is a must, however it is leveraged, has to accommodate that reality and diffuse it. And the only way to diffuse it is to give both of them equal say and to have a third party, the largest third party, whoever it is, with a swing vote in all those decision-making seats of power. So that when your Afro-Guyanese from Tocqueville goes to vote and your Indo-Guyanese from Lusignan goes to vote, he's pretty well assured that the outcome of the election will be an equal say for PPP and for APNU, so that it diffuses the winner-take-all mutual suspicion and fear of ostracism that takes place now. Otherwise, we will have the same problem every 5 years.
Yeah.
You can like it or lump it. I hear the various supporters saying, no, we will never have discussion with those evil people. not recognizing that their own people are equally evil. But there needs to be a system that both sides are equal, and that there is a third party that can jump into the fray. That's the only way to do it.
And Bertrand, for your final comments, this current conflict is a very, very bold example of our fracture, and we will continue to have these. How do we move forward from here in the immediate term, in terms of the winner-take-all system? How do we reassure the other side, whichever side that is, whoever wins, somebody's going to win over the next? If it's not next week, or the other week is next month, or the following month, how do we let the other side know that they're not going to be out of government?
Well, I don't know if you're going to see a winner, you said, in a few weeks or a month. I don't know if that's going to happen. And again, I'm being optimistic. Yeah, I'm normally optimistic too, but I'm just saying that given what I know about my homeland in Guyana, and what I know about politics in Guyana. So, they say every rope has two ends. And at a certain point, if you're climbing on one end of the rope, you're going to reach the other end. But when we reach the other end, you can't tie a knot and keep hanging, because at a certain point, you're going to fall and slip. So my point is, this government in office is immovable. They have said it in many different ways. I do hope that the protests that I've talked about, again, safe, controlled, peaceful protests inside and outside of Guyana, call for sanctions will continue, especially from the U.S., because I do believe if the U.S. And Canada, especially the U.S., but Canada, Britain, and so on take the lead, you're going to put more pressure. But from all appearance, this government doesn't seem to want to move. So I think all of those comprehensive kinds of pressure, continued protests and so on, has to continue. And as Tim says, there's got to be a breaking point someplace. But I do believe in the interim, it will help. And it may go a long way if political leaders can recognize that here, we can't have a divided society like this. And they need to reach out with an olive branch and talk about, hey, we want to share power. We want to talk about inclusive government. We're not going to govern for 40 years. We're not going to govern by controlling the coercive forces. We're going to have changes. We're going to have constitutional changes. And that fear has to be addressed, right? So the question is, how do we get from here to there? I'm saying if all of those comprehensive things we talk about continue, because we can't just sit back and say, well, what is Mingo going to do next? Or what is Lowenfield? Or what is the CEO of GCOM going to do next? Well, Mingo is out of the picture as of now. So the point is, the question is, what are we going to do as opposition? Because we've come to a point where your backs are against the wall, and I'm going to put the onus. I'm going to put the onus on the leadership in Guyana. I'm going to put this onus on Irfan Ali, on Jack Dale, on Tim Jonas, on Schumann. My challenge to you folks is, as leaders, you want to be able to be out there to show people that there are things that we can continue to do to put pressure on this government. And I think when you get involved in those things, and again, I'm saying peaceful, right, control and safe environment, whether it's outside or inside of Guyana, I think that will continue to keep the pressure on the government while we're calling for sanctions, because I don't see any other way where this is going. And if you allow the dictatorship to continue, whether it's an increment, is going to get to a point where we're going to see another 28 years and people will be saying, well, the struggle will continue. Well, we thought we ended that, after the 28 years. We thought that was over in 1992, but here we are at a situation where we're back to square one. So I think leadership has to be effective and call for increased pressure. At the same time, talk about how we are going to create inclusivity and how we're going to govern together so that all Guyanese benefit. And it's not just folks from one political party are going to benefit. So I think this is where my hope lies, is that we will get to that point where leaders will say, look, let's sit down around the round table with international pressure, whether it's coming from the US or other places, to get these folks together to talk about sharing. And then we can talk about how that arrangement will, what it will look like at that point. But right now, our dilemma is, You want to get over this electoral process, and a leader should be sworn in.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Betaram Ramharack. Thank you very much, Timothy Jonas, for this very engaging discussion on making sense of our political conflict. I guess this discussion will continue until we get the leaders to understand and to reach over and to build a real coalition that represents all ethnic group and making them all feel inclusive, comfortable, and a meaningful participation in the democratic process in Guyana. I want to again apologize to our audience that we did not have a PNC representative. I know many comments were made about the PNC and they were not here to defend themselves. So hopefully next week or following week or some other show, they will find it necessary to be on this show to represent their side of the story. Again, the key issue in Guyana is a winner take all, and unless the winner in the upcoming election shows a very honest posturing on reaching out, we can be in this situation for a very long time. Again, thank you, viewers, for tuning in this Wednesday. We'll be on next Monday and next Wednesday again. Stay tuned, be informed, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, and let's promote a peaceful transition to a better Guyana in the nearest possible time, in the closest possible time. Thank you again, and best wishes to everyone, and a good night. Peace, love.
Good night, Tim. Tim, good night.
Okay.
Salim, good night.
Yeah, good night, guys.